archaeologist. He's a former colleague. He taught in the UCD School of Classics and acted as curator of the UCD Classical Museum in 2018. His published research focuses on interdisciplinary approaches to warfare, violence, and society in Aegean prehistory. He's also a find specialist, a field archaeologist, and currently he's working on post-excavation for the Olynthus project, and he has a chapter coming out in the Brill's Companion to Warfare in the Bronze Age Aegean on warfare and social complexity from late Helladic III to the early Iron Age. So just to give you a bit of background on this particular session. So somewhere around the beginning of the year, I noticed, this is just after the book came out. So the real topic of today's talk is on this book by Graeber and Wengrow. And I noticed on Twitter that Stephen had started a little thread where he was saying that he was going to collect some critical reviews, saying that the really important thing we need to do is not just accept the book and look at the various popular reviews, but look at scholarly, critical, academic reviews, because this is such an important book. So I asked Stephen if he wanted to come along, give us some preliminary findings on that at this seminar, and he said yes, and that's what we're here for today. And things work out really well. That I found out just a few days ago that Archaeology have had a reading group, and that's Graham Warren's been leading that, on exactly the same thing. I'll ask Graham to talk to us at the end, because David Wengrow is coming to UCD for an in-conversation in a couple of weeks. So that's something we'd want to promote. But we'll leave that for later. This is a book that people, I think, will have strong opinions on, or opinions on anyway. If you haven't started reading it, the whole point of this is to get you interested. So I hand over to Stephen now, and really looking forward to what you've got to say.
Yes, so I'd like to obviously start by saying thanks to UCD School of Classics for inviting me to do this session, and thanks to everyone who's come along to see it. And as Alex has said, today I'm going to be really looking at some of the critical responses to Graeber and Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And this book was published last year by the anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow. And it was published, unfortunately, not long after David Graeber very sadly passed away. And subsequently, the book has been an international bestseller, and it's received a sort of wide variety of positive reviews in the mass media. Now, the book has a global scope, and it really sets out to cover the entirety of human existence on Earth. And of course, this makes reviewing it quite difficult for most people because of the sheer amount of background knowledge that you would have to have in order to be able to give it a sort of very thorough critique. Certainly, there's a wide variety of things in this book that I am by no means sort of an expert on. And so for that reason, what I wanted to do was to look at some of the expert reviews that have now emerged about this book. And my focus is going to be really on critical reviews, because, again, I feel that those give us some of the best chance at weighing up positives and negatives of the book, if we can assess sort of the particular things and whether we agree with the kinds of pushback that maybe have been happening. But despite my focus today on those sort of critical expert reviews, I wouldn't want to give the impression that somehow the book was incredibly unpopular with experts. There are, in fact, also expert reviews that are maybe more positive than some of the examples I'm going to be looking at in depth here. And the two examples listed on this slide, fairly recent reviews from Antiquity and from Anthropology Today, are certainly examples of extremely positive expert reviews that the book has received. And because not everyone has necessarily had a chance to read the book itself yet, I think it's probably worth examining what the main claims and concepts that The Dawn of Everything sort of puts forward really are. And generally, it would be fair to say that the book is against any idea of there being a simple social evolution taking place over the last 30,000 years, one that took us from sort of small egalitarian forager bands, all the way through various stages up to the modern state. And a variety of different kinds of evidence are brought in to critique that idea. And starting off, Graeber and Wengrow put forward the idea of the indigenous critique, which is that the indigenous people of North America developed a very sophisticated political critique of the kinds of inequalities that they observed in European societies compared to their own, and that this actually directly inspired European Enlightenment thinkers from the particularly 17th and 18th centuries AD onwards. Going much further back in time, they hold that ancient foragers were not necessarily confined to small egalitarian bands. Because Graeber and Wengrow are very against seeing sort of any kind of aspect of the mode of production as determining a society's political structure, they believe much more in things like seasonality, a concept in which these forager groups, I should say, might be egalitarian and free-ranging in the summer, but during the winter could become settled and actually adopt a much more authoritarian political structure to their society. And in terms of explaining the cultural group differences between human groups, Graeber and Wengrow put great stock in schismogenesis, which was originally put forward in anthropology by Bateson in the 1930s. And Graeber and Wengrow's use of it is to explain cultural differences as to not being materially determined, or for that matter, culturally determined, but it makes the point that they're actually a deliberate moral and ethical choice, often based on being able to compare and contrast themselves with a neighboring society that has a different set of moral and ethical values. And these two concepts, the seasonality and the schismogenesis, are actually completely central to Graeber and Wengrow's explanation of how human societies developed across time. Some further claims is that Graeber and Wengrow certainly would say that there was never any kind of agricultural revolution in the Neolithic. Instead of agriculture representing a sort of comparatively short-term step change in the nature of human societies, a literal revolution, they would hold that farming matured very slowly, and that hybrid forager-farmer arrangements actually endured for millennia. In their view, agriculture started out as flood retreat play farming, which would take place on the margins of seasonally flooding lakes and rivers. And certainly in Graeber and Wengrow's account, such farming is unsuited to the development of private property and wouldn't be relied upon for the majority of food production. It would really be more of a supplemental source. Moving on into the sort of world of early sort of urban societies. In Graeber and Wengrow's account, early cities, which might perhaps include the sort of mega sites of Ukraine and Moldova, could in fact be democratic and egalitarian in the nature of their structure. They weren't necessarily authoritarian, which they say has been the sort of dominant mode of trying to explain those cities in the past. And in terms of freedom, Graeber and Wengrow create a system of three essential forms of freedom, those being freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create and transform different social relationships. And the counterpoint to those, they come up with three forms of domination, ways in which freedom can be constrained or taken away. And they feel that those three basic forms of domination are charismatic competitive politics, bureaucracy, and violent sovereignty. And again, they seek to change, in their view, the idea of how the state came about, because they feel that initially those three forms of domination don't come together as all three, as we would have in the modern state, but first they come in perhaps ones or twos, creating maybe play kings to go along with that play farming. But both farming and the state become much more serious and much more permanent later on. And it's also worth paying attention to what Graeber and Wengrow hold is their central question in the book, essentially one of how humans as a species got stuck in a single mode of hierarchical submission to political or other kinds of authority. And this question and what they may have as an answer to it is something that we'll be coming back to towards the end of this session. But before then, I'd like to get into some of the detail of some of the critical expert reviews of the book that have emerged. And perhaps the first major review that came out was in the New York Review of Books by Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's a professor of philosophy at Princeton. And this review was followed in the same publication by an exchange of letters between Wengrow and Appiah discussing the review. And perhaps as befits his philosophical background, Appiah initially sort of has some issues with Graeber and Wengrow on their apparent claim that there wasn't a European concept of social inequality prior to the 17th century AD. He notes, for example, that there were European groups at that time, such as the Hutterites, who had no private property and elected positions of authority, which perhaps makes them analogous to some of the indigenous societies of North America that Graeber and Wengrow feel are so important in the genesis of the European Enlightenment. Now, in Wengrow's response to that review, the letters that were sent to the New York Review of Books, he does say that in that chapter, they're never arguing for there being a lack of a concept of social inequality in Europe, but instead they wanted to know why it was at that time that Europeans started to try and find the origins of inequality. And that might well be the case, but I think as Appiah has noted, in that case, it's not entirely clear what passages like this one are doing, because they seem fairly unequivocal that prior to the 17th century AD, in the medieval period, there simply wasn't the concept of social equality or inequality in medieval Europe. Now, this, of course, is one of the areas that I'm absolutely not any kind of expert in, and perhaps for that reason, I'm prepared to be cheerfully agnostic on the question of whether there was significant indigenous influence on the European Enlightenment. I do think it's a fascinating idea, and I look forward to there being future work on it, but for the time being, it's not something that I can sort of weigh in on particularly. In any case, I think that what Graeber and Wengrow successfully do in the book is make their most important point, which is that indigenous societies, and by extension societies in the past, had conscious politics and could at least attempt to structure themselves with specific outcomes in mind. Now, turning to some of the archaeological claims made in the book, Appiah feels that the authors often work by giving us two mutually exclusive options that we have to pick between without there necessarily being anything in the middle that we might prefer instead. And I think a lot of what he talks about are the examples of the apparently democratic cities that Graeber and Wengrow identify. But what Appiah would say is that with, for example, the megasite of Nebelivka in Ukraine, the actual archaeological excavator of those sites doesn't necessarily want to interpret them as cities, or at least not cities as we would generally understand them. And elsewhere in the world, at the Indus Valley site of Mohenjo-Daro, which, because it has no convincing evidence of there being monarchy or kingship, Graeber and Wengrow sort of want to interpret that as being the signs of a democratic and egalitarian structure to the city. And again, at Teotihuacan in Mexico, archaeologists have proposed a variety of other options as to how that city was ruled, which are different to the sort of egalitarian and democratic setup that Graeber and Wengrow are arguing for. And it's also possible that in cases there's some contrary evidence maybe being ignored, as at Mashkon Shapir in Iraq, where again Graeber and Wengrow are arguing for this kind of egalitarian democratic setup with a fairly even distribution of wealth. But on Appier's reading of the same article that those authors mention, their interpretations are of a walled-off enclosure existing in the site, and that there being at least noticeable disparities in household wealth. Now, again, in his response, Wengrow has pointed out that in each of these cases, these aren't interpretations that have been come up with sort of out of whole cloth by Graeber and Wengrow. They're always an interpretation that's been put forward by an archaeologist specializing in that region or that site. But Appie is really contending that the problem is that these other possibilities, these other interpretations of that evidence never really get mentioned at all. And Graeber and Wengrow do very correctly make the point that in the absence of written sources, archaeology will almost certainly not detect democracy in 5th century Athens. And as I say, that is an absolutely correct point. But I think it can also cut both ways, in the sense that in the absence of written sources, archaeology probably also wouldn't detect the era in which Pericles had instituted a sort of de facto one-man rule in the city, and it probably wouldn't detect that the Spartans had installed the 30 tyrants at the end of the 5th century either. I do feel that the idea of being more willing to find democracies in the past is a valid and interesting one. And I think an archaeology of democracy is an extremely interesting project, and it's something that would be worth spending more time on. But a second significant review that I'd like to discuss today has been given by Walter Scheidel, an ancient historian who's lecturing at Stanford. And his review is actually available online as a kind of preprint of something that's eventually going to be appearing in the journal Cliodynamics. Now, Scheidel takes a slightly different approach from Appiah, saying that what he's really interested in doing is focusing on some of the large-scale questions that Graeber and Wengrow throw up, rather than sort of trying to dig into lots of detail. And in terms of early foraging societies, Scheidel asks whether foragers apparently being willing to engage in these seasonal experiments, maybe in hierarchy, whether that makes the break with later periods of more permanent hierarchy being established actually less pronounced and maybe easier to manage in that sense. And he also asks whether these kinds of seasonal shifts in sort of structure of society, if those are based on particular ecological conditions and foraging strategies, rather than being something that happened more or less everywhere in the world, if it's a slightly different pattern. And in terms of the start of farming, he questions Graeber and Wengrow's apparent claim that there's no sort of simple or obvious link between areas of the world which had early crop domestication and areas of the world which formed early states. This is the actual map that they use in the book to look at plant and animal domestication around the world. And Scheidel certainly would argue that the only places where early crops were domesticated that didn't then go on to generate early states are Amazonia, North America, and New Guinea. And certainly in Scheidel's view, that's probably due to the crops in those areas either being poorly storable or difficult to appropriate, making them sort of materially unsuitable for the production of state societies. And he suggests that if the transition to agriculture took millennia rather than being a sort of quick step change revolution, then there's no reason to expect social inequality to have done anything other than also develop over several millennia. Now, turning again to the idea or question of cities, Scheidel identifies a similar problem to Appiah in that the evidence for kings not being present is automatically seen as meaning that this was a place with a comparatively, at least, egalitarian and democratic society. But this really overlooks that there's a variety of systems that we can have that aren't kingdoms, but also aren't necessarily democracies either. And I think a particularly interesting example of this that Graeber and Wengrow discuss in the book is Tlaxcala, the 16th century AD Mesoamerican state, which allied with Hernan Cortes and allowed him to defeat the Aztecs. And they, again, perfectly correctly cite Cortes writing to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and describing Tlaxcala as being organized as a republic like Venice or Genoa or Pisa at the time, and not, as it's often been interpreted in later accounts, as being a kingdom. But what they leave out is the second part of the passage, where Cortes also mentions the presence of lords and their agrarian vassals. And according to a book called The Decline and Rise of Democracy, published in 2020 by Stabasage, Tlaxcala in this era was ruled by a council of between 50 and 100 mostly hereditary nobles. So it's not a monarchy, but it's not really a democracy in the sense that we'd often think of it either. And it's totally plausible that similarly undemocratic systems might have existed in some of the ancient places that Graeber and Wengrow have not been able to detect monarchy as existing in. And again, I should say, I am highly sympathetic to both finding more political variation in the past and indeed to finding possible democracies in the past. But it does seem that some of the evidential base for finding democracy in the examples in this book by Graeber and Wengrow maybe tend to be a bit weak. Scheidel is a bit more favourable when it comes to talking about the author's three forms of domination, that idea of violent sovereignty, bureaucracy, and charismatic politics as being the sort of three key factors. And their model of how these things are either present or not in different examples around the world provides a way of creating a sort of historically specific trajectories for societies and understanding different strategies that were used in different times and places. It isn't the only such model of this kind. Scheidel actually mentions the sociologist Michael Mann's model from the mid-1980s. It's the IEMP model for ideological, economic, military, and political. And again, that's where Mann has identified these sort of four pillars and the ways in which they do or don't interact as being a way that we can look at how societies function. Now, overall, in his review, Scheidel tends to criticize Graeber and Wengrow for what he sees as their extremely idealist rather than materialist approach. And on this point, I feel I do have to have at least some sympathy with David Wengrow, who's talked online about how he feels there's actually substantially more materialism in the book than people are maybe giving it credit for. And I do think that's the case. I personally particularly taken with their suggestion that foraging societies in past eras could well have been able to amass a significant amount of surplus, allowing class societies to develop well before they would normally been seen to have developed with agriculture. And that, of course, is a perfectly materialist point. And it might even be argued that materialism occasionally pops its head up in the narrative, even when Graeber and Wengrow would perhaps rather it didn't. They discuss that possibly the most essential of their three forms of freedom is the freedom to move, the ability to literally escape from other people and people's efforts to control you is perhaps foundational to the other freedoms being possible at all. And they mention that the sort of large areas and comparatively low populations of North America allowed that freedom to move as something that could happen there. But it can be argued that that suggests that it's at least partly something that's being materially conditioned rather than simply being a choice that's made. And the third review that I wanted to discuss in this session is the one published by Brian Fagan and Nadia Durrani in Reviews in Anthropology. And this one is perhaps more finely balanced than Appier's or Scheidl's reviews. They're certainly very praising of the book's celebration of political diversity in both present and the past. And they notice its coverage of a wide range of societies that maybe diverge from broad patterns, from sort of simplistic schemes. But like the other reviews, they do tend to feel that quite often some alternative theories or explanations are dismissed out of hand without there being a full discussion of the evidence for them. And they note that sometimes we get strong conclusions being drawn from comparatively thin evidence. And one thing that they do notice that other reviewers haven't talked very much about is that they see there being a comparative absence of climate change in this book, at least in the sense of it being a sort of problem or a negative, a constraint on human societies. There is mention at various places in the book of climate change sometimes being beneficial. They point out, of course, that from things like stabilizing sea levels were what allowed agriculture to develop. But as Fagan and Durrani note at one point, Doggerland disappeared beneath the North Sea in around 6,500 BC. And that clearly presented the humans living there at the time with a significant problem, a significant constraint on them. And modern climate change similarly is going to present a significant challenge to us, which makes maybe the lack of discussion of it here interesting. And Fagan and Durrani also make a point that I think almost every review, whether it be particularly positive or negative of the book, has made. Having told us that the central question of the book is the one about how we got stuck in top-down hierarchical control, they arguably never quite answer this question. In the last chapter, there is this passage in which they suggest that it's something to do with people starting to lose that freedom to imagine and enact other forms of social existence. And I think it's possible that this kind of emphasis on the imagination, which is something that runs throughout the book, is quite possibly where some of the criticism of the book as being idealist comes from. Personally, I'm not convinced that we've had a particular shortage of people imagining other ways of living. It seems to be much more a case of implementing those ways that seems to be more of a problem. Now, in this last chapter, Graeber and Wengrow do make some suggestions, tentative suggestions maybe, about how this getting stuck in this mode of living has happened. And they suggest that it's something to do with that process of schismogenesis of human groups into smaller and smaller cultures. They suggest that it's something to do with the institution of patriarchal households. And they suggest that it's something to do with the provision of charity. Because again, another theme running through the book is of how, in the author's view, systems of care can quite often be converted into systems of domination. And in terms of how this explains the current makeup of the world, and perhaps why the current makeup of the world seems so difficult to change, these points perhaps need more development. And I do understand that the authors did plan at least 2 follow-up books to this one. And so it's entirely possible that work would have been carried out there and may in fact still be carried out by David Wengrow. So in conclusion, what is the contribution of this book? And I would certainly say at this point, and again, this is a thing which pretty much every reviewer of the book has in common, whether they particularly liked it or not, is that they do feel it's well worth reading. There is a wealth of information in here which is highly interesting, even if you end up disagreeing with large sections of their conclusions or the interpretation or the general thrust of the book. I personally feel that perhaps human societies are operating under more constraints than Graeber and Wengrow are necessarily willing to allow for. And going slightly more parochial, but I am being hosted by the School of Classics at UCD. I think there's actually a lot of here that is of interest to classicists, if we think about it in terms of discussion of things like democracy and cities and political dynamics and slavery from an anthropological point of view. I felt for some time that classics probably needs to do a better job of placing itself into a more global context. And some of these discussions and material provided here are certainly a way of doing that. Back in 2018, when I was lucky enough to be in the classics department at UCD, one of the things I taught was the Lost Cities of the Ancient World module. And given that that module obviously has a lot of discussion as to what a city is and how they develop, then material like some of that debate about the megasites in Ukraine and Moldova as to whether they're cities, and if they aren't, why not? I think that's something that would be potentially very useful to the students of a module like that. Now, lots in this book isn't necessarily going to be particularly new to archaeologists or anthropologists. I feel, for example, that their argument that the Neolithic actually took quite a long time to do the things it did is something that I think has been pretty mainstream in archaeology for a while now. But a lot of the reaction to the book from the general public is that they do feel that these are things that they haven't necessarily heard before. And so I think arguably archaeologists and other researchers maybe need to do a better job at synthesizing and publicizing their work, which is something that this book has definitely done. And another reason why this book is going to be particularly worth reading is, again, because it has been a bestseller. It's certainly captured the public's imagination. And so it's going to inform the approaches that they have and some of the questions that they're asking as we go forward. So I think it's important to be aware of what the book is saying. Now, the book isn't necessarily always convincing in some of its biggest points. I think my perspective would be that the Neolithic may well not have been a revolution, but it was in fact still revolutionary. The things that happened in the long term were in fact extremely significant. And similarly, Graeber and Wengrow make the claim essentially that living in states can be considered as abnormal for humans, because they say that most of existence has been conducted with state types of society not existing. And that's one of those things where it's certainly true, in a sense, it's true chronologically and spatially, but it's also true that in terms of demographics, the vast majority of people who have ever existed have in fact lived inside some form of state society. And something interesting, I guess, summing up on this book, is that when someone makes a concerted effort to overturn everything, as arguably many people have said this book does, then it's important to pay attention to what remains standing at the end of that. So that's my session for today. And I'd just like to leave you with this list of the sources that I've put together this session from. As I say, I do highly recommend reading this book. And I also highly recommend reading it in the context of at least some of this review material to get a great sense as to the kind of points that are being made. Thank you.